Okay. This is ego-utilitarianism, egotism. This presentation is about just some dialogue I've been having with Tenuous Theories about difference curves. He mentioned at first he didn't believe negative utility was acknowledged in classical economics, and I disputed otherwise. And he mentioned about it, something about like the indifference curve crossing an axis, which is possible, but in circumstances. But I think he was referring to the case where you have two normal goods, which wouldn't be the case if you started anywhere. You started kind of anywhere, like in the first quadrant or something like that. But let me explain kind of like my intuition on indifference curves. It's so when they show you the indifference curves in of normal goods, right? Not complements or substitutes. I'm not exactly sure the mathematical definition of a normal good. It must be somewhere in the middle or something. But when they show you indifference curves, you're actually only seeing a little side of it, I believe. Like I think real indifference curves, they're essentially, everyone knows just from the definition, they're total utility curve. They're equitotal utility curves. So they're level curves. So they're level curves, right, of the total utility surface. So if you imagine the total utility surface, so on the z-axis is total utility. On the x and y-axis are the quantities, the different quantities you can consume of each respective of the two goods under consideration, right? So I claim that they're going to be ellipses. And my first intuition was that it's going to be circle, just because when Tenuous mentioned that they were going to cross the axis, I thought otherwise, right? I told them it was actually going to lift off, right? So you can imagine kind of like a normal good where they're asymptotic with respect to the x and y axes. He thought they were going to probably, instead of like approach x-axis, turn and cross, but I felt like, since you're decreasing utility as you increase utility after once you get into negative utility, so when a good turns into a bad, consuming more units will necessarily decrease your total utility. So in order to stay in the total utility curve, you have to balance that out more utility. So again, if you're going to increase the amount of a bad, so it turns into a bad, you're consuming more units of it. That means you're decreasing total utility. That means you have to compensate and stay on the total utility curve by increasing the other good that's hopefully still a good at that point. And therefore, it'll start to lift off. And in actuality, what you'll get is like, so at this point, if the x and y axes, right, what they usually show you is kind of this portion. And what I thought is, so these are the critical points when each good represented on their respective axes turns into a bad, when it starts accumulating negative utility as you increase marginal units, right? So at this point, you see here how it lifts off. This is my intuition at first. And I was only considering like one side, and then it kind of felt like it was going to do the same thing symmetrically across the line equals y equals x, right? So I thought I was going to have in here too, to lift off away from the axes, right? So it approaches axes and it lifts off after the critical points. And then what happens is there's two other critical points, right? And essentially it's just going to make an orbit. And the shape of the orbit is determined by the magnitudes of the critical points. And that's what I claim here. So if the indifference curves, which are equitotal utility curves, which is the same thing as saying they're level curves of the total utility surface. And again, I described that in 3 dimensions. I think this is just a stupid thought I wrote down. Because, okay, little tangent. Tenuous doesn't think circles exist, right? There's no, in other words, the meta self of circles does not have any instances, as egotism would say. But I've already tried to explain to him there was an instance of circles in space itself, right? All the points equidistant from any fixed point on any respective plane is a circle. I mean, it exists. You can't fill it in perfectly with mass to represent it perceptually, but it exists nonetheless. And even if you don't accept that, right? If this argument is valid about indifference curves being ellipses, and potentially circles are a subset of ellipses, and I'll show when it happens, that if indifference curves exist and circular indifference curves exist, therefore I can actually show, without even referencing space, that circles exist in the form of indifference curves. If you acknowledge they exist, therefore there must be instances of the meta self of circle. Okay, so anyways, that's just a side topic for Tenuous. But so here's my resolution. So he had a complaint, right? He was talking about, let me read what he wrote. Hopefully I have it queued up. Okay, so he goes, I talked to Mike Hugman. Circles were the immediate idea, meaning it's probably intuitive, right? Somewhat, you kind of intuitively think, hey, it might be circle. But, okay, so like a utility hill with contours. So yes, he's talking about level curves of the utility, the total utility surface, given two goods, right? However, the problem with that is that the other, so this is tenuous. However, the problem with that is that the other side of this hill, and I'm assuming, like, you know, he's starting at the maximum point on the surface, right? On the other side of the hill represents disutility, whereas the side of the hill closer to the origin, right, represents being less than satisfied. So anywhere other than the peak of the curve is not the maximization of the total utility surface. But there's also another constraint he doesn't see here, which I'll bring up. Which you can probably read down below. Anyways, these two, he goes on further to say, these two states cannot be equivalent. Of course they cannot be. They're different level curves he's talking about. And the level curves are selected based upon your budget constraints, which I'll get to a little later. So he goes on to say, these two states cannot be equivalent. For example, let's assume that so he gives a numerical example. I'll just skip that. But if we have circles, and I claim it's actually ellipses, right? To be general. So you can have circles, but it's a special case. That means that as far as utility is concerned, I'm going to say, so I'm assuming he's moving up the utility curve, and he's jumping level curves and saying that they're different total utility. Obviously, yeah, because you're not staying on the utility curve, a particular indifference curve, right? You're jumping, and you see this represented in regular Econ 101 as these different utility curves. They're actually shifting up this level curve based upon budget constraints, right? And your budget constraint is so anyways, so underfed and overfed are different experiences. So of course, yeah, different level curves are different, duh. And then so that resolves this problem, right? So Tenuous, I hope you can address that. We've been going back and forth the message. I think your intuition is incorrect here. So anyways, so if a hill, perhaps one side of the hill would be continuous, the other side would be discontinuous, drop into negative utility. I don't know what he means by continuous and discontinuous. It's a continuous surface. Well, theoretically, right? I mean, it's a continuous surface. There's no discontinuity to talk about here. The thing that I think except that now when you bring in budget constraints and PPFs, you're talking about 4 dimensions, right? So there's a 4th dimension you're not considering here, which is budget constraints. We intersect the surface utility curve to determine what level curve or what indifference curve you're operating on, right? So the other side would be discontinuous drop into negative. I'm just going to disregard that as my explanation is hopefully suffice. So I don't think that an indifference curve can ever take a nice shape. Realistic curves wouldn't even be continuous but discrete. They might look piecewise function. I don't know. I'm not going to read that because I think that's invalid at this point. All analysis here is kind of fallacious. I don't mean to insult you, Tenuous, but I think your intuition drove you wrong here. So let me get back to my presentation because I'm under time constraints. Okay, so the indifference curve will be an ellipse intuitively, right? So you're seeing this in Econ 101, what they don't show you is the rest of it. Obviously, as you increase a unit of a bad, so at this point it becomes X becomes a bad. Therefore, when you increase quantity, you start to decrease total utility. In order to compensate and stay on the level curve, you must increase what's still a good, right? So that means it starts to lift off. And at this point, both are bad, right? Now, now, you cannot stay on the level curve out here. You cannot increase both because you're increasing actually this way. I don't know. Yeah, this way, because you're increasing both at the same time. So there's no way you can keep increasing a bad. And since you've already hit the critical point, you cannot increase y at the same time and stay on the utility curve. So you can see you can't pass this. There are no points on the indifference curve, no x coordinates, x coordinate component of any points on the indifference curve that go beyond this point, right? And same thing for this. There's no y coordinates on this indifference curve that can exceed this quantity, right? So you can see here, and this is what I'm talking about here. So okay, so let me read this through. The major and minor axes, right? So determine your critical points of when, okay, let me read this. The major and minor axes, x equals qx and y equals qy, quantity of x, quantity y, represent the critical quantities of each respective good/bad where marginal utility changes from positive to negative, or vice versa, depending on where you are on any respective elliptical indifference curve. The intersection of each respective critical lines is the center of the elliptical indifference curve, right? Right here. So from the center, you can kind of gauge what in what quadrant it lies in. Oh, both the center and the magnitudes of qx, qy will tell you if it crosses any axes and what its domain is as far as the Cartesian plane, right? If it's an all 4, if it's 2 of 4, if it's in 3 of 4. I don't think you can get 3 of 4. No, I don't think you can get 3 of 4 geometrically. You can get yeah, you can. You can probably get 3 or 4. So you can get the indifference, the area, the inside portion of the indifference curve can lie in any. It can be in 1, 2, or 3 of the 4 quadrants of the Cartesian plane. I contend, right? So if the axes are both, let's see, determines if it crosses any axis. Okay, so the intersection of each respective critical lines, right? Qx, qy, x equals qx, y equals qy. Yeah, that's right. The intersection of each respective critical lines is the center of the elliptical indifference curve, and together with the magnitude of the critical quantities, qx, qy, both of these determine if it crosses any of the axes on the graph, and also what quadrants the area of the ellipse lies in, right? The elliptical indifference curve will lie. Oh, okay. If axes are both positive, meaning the critical quantities are both positive, then the center of the ellipse will lie in the first quadrant. If the critical quantities are both negative, right, then they lie in the third quadrant. That means, yeah, I gotta think about that later. If they are either negative, positive, and positive, negative, then the centers of each ellipse will be in the second and fourth quadrant, respectively. If the magnitudes of the critical quantities are equal, right? So we're talking about just the magnitudes, right, of qx, qy. Then you will have a circular indifference curve. So this is the special case of the general case, somewhere on the Cartesian plane. So he's talking about the hill, right, and the total utility surface, which these indifference curves are sections or cross sections of, right here. So you can see the surface, and you can see like it's a cross section. And so he's picturing, oh yeah, okay, so he's picturing like this hill here. And so he's saying at this top point, this is the maximum total utility, and he's talking about operating somewhere else on this hill, right? Either on any respective side. I mean, each cross section is an equa total utility curve or indifference curve. And so what he's making the mistake is he's jumping from here to here, and he's saying, hey, there's a contradiction here or a paradox here, because it doesn't make sense. You're saying these two total utilities are the same. No, I'm not. No, not actually. Let's stay on the difference curve. This is when utility is the same. The equitotal utility, right? Jumping from here to here necessarily changes utility, and the indifference curve you're operating on is the one that's tangent to the budget constraint surface, probably something like that. Probably it's going to be like a surface, right? Okay, so the top of the level surface may represent the maximum utility, right? So this point, one can get from consuming these two goods. So if you consider the plane that this cone is standing on, this is the consumption possibilities, right? Even taking into account negative units you can consume. So the top of the level surface may represent the maximum utility one can get from consuming two goods right here. The budget constraint, a meta self production capacity, right? Whatever actor can produce, right, determines his budget constraint surface or line. So they say there's like budget constraints like this that they intersect this indifference curve, and you get based upon your budget constraint, you can select the indifference curve tangent to this to maximize total utility, and that's the same thing. It goes. It has a 3D. It has a general 3D equivalent. Hey Derek, give me a second. Hey Derek.